All right, welcome to this continuing education session by iLevel by Weyerhaeuser. My name is Dan Harris. I'm the Director of Construction and Sales Training for the company. And this particular session on selecting fire and sound framing assemblies for EWP, we're going to look at specifically just a single case study so that we can quickly go through the issues, find the key elements that we need to know, and be able to get it to put together a decent specification. And before we move on to the next slide, take a look there. You're going to need to know some of this information. 3 stories, 4 units, 44-foot total height. So keep that in the back of your mind or scribble it on a piece of paper. Let's move on. So ultimately what we're trying to do here again is we want to get through the code book, through the relevant sections. We want to be able to understand where we're headed, pick out some assemblies very quickly, get them onto a draft piece of paper so we can hand them off to our engineer, and get some information on a spec sheet that we can give or put on the title block, or the title sheet, excuse me, for the building inspector or the plans examiner. So let's jump into this thing. So now you can see our basic floor plan. This is just a rough sketch of it. Obviously not all the doors and windows have been put in here, but you can see the overall dimensions which we need to know, roughly 100 feet by roughly 50 feet. We'll use those dimensions as we go through the code book. You can see it's broken up into 4 different units. They're kind of odd shaped there, a little bit angled shaped. There's a garage associated with each one of those units. And that you also see that there's right-of-ways on 3 sides and a property line on one edge. And those are right up against the edge of the building. So if you got that sort of picture memorized, if you want to make a quick sketch of it, now's a good time to do it. We'll move on and see what we have to do with this now. But before we actually do that, I should bring up that there's a few things. Obviously, every project's going to be a little bit unique. And in this particular case, the building department is going to require sprinklers. It's out of our hands. We know it's got to be on the plans, and that will play into our decision making. The second thing is these are a little bit higher end units, and the architect was very concerned to make sure that the sound ratings, the STC and the IIC, STC is airborne sound, IIC is impact sound, and both of those ratings are slightly better than code because he built some prior units. They weren't quite as good, and you can see some of the issues that he had to wrestle there with plumbing, and now he's going to have to put in all tile and hardwood on these floors. There's no carpeted areas. So that will play into some of our factors. Let's move on here. So the very first thing, jump into the code book. I know it's a thick piece of information to go through, but there's one very simple place to jump in the very front end, which is the different occupancy groups. This is going to be residential. It's going to be an R group. There's 4 different types, as you can see listed there. And I'd actually have them slightly out of order if you notice. There's 1, 2, 4, and then 3. The reason for that is 1, 2, and 4 are very specific with respect to the occupancy, who's going to be in it, whether it's transient, non-transient, etc. R4 is a bit, or R3, excuse me, is a little bit of a grab bag. So I can tell you right now we're going to be in R2. Even though it doesn't say condominiums, it's going to fit in that whole grouping of dormitories, apartments, townhouses, things of that nature. So just plan on it. When you get into a project like this, it's going to be R2. Also at the bottom, notice there's also going to be a group U, which is a utility structure, which if you look at the definitions in the code book about this, that will also include your private garages. But that'll be a secondary issue here. Let's move on. So once we know that we're our occupancy group, now we have to look at the type of construction. At the very front end, I mentioned to you that this is going to be wood frame. I'm not going to argue about should have been steel, if it was concrete, etc. The decision was made, so let's just stick with it. And as soon as it's wood frame construction, you can pretty well bet that it's going to be type 5. And then beyond that, the next question is going to be type 5A or type 5B. We're going to use this in the very next piece here. So 5A is essentially protected construction, and generally speaking, again, when you're into a multi-unit light commercial type of structure, all the assemblies, floors, walls, roofs, etc., will probably be protected by something with 1 hour, 2 hour, etc. And So more than likely will usually be a 5A. It is possible to have 5B. I'm not going to argue that point here, but just generally speaking, 5A is the most common. So now we knew two pieces of this, and you can see them at the top of your screen there. So with those two pieces of information, let's go into table 503. And so now you can see in one portion of it, you've got type 5A. On the other side, you can see the group R2. We read across, and what it says there is we can have up to 3 stories, 12,000 square feet per floor, and then the maximum height of the structure is 50 feet. Well, we're 44 feet, we're 3 floors, and just in rough numbers again, without having the detailed plans and going through the analysis, because there's a special way to actually calculate that square footage, we're going to be roughly 5,000 square feet. We're well under that square footage. This confirms it. Now, it is possible when you start a project that sometimes you're not sure which type should be 5A or 5B. And it is possible to go into this chart the opposite direction, such that you look at where you want to be, right? So whether it's 2 floors and 7,000 square feet or 3 floors and 12,000 square feet, you're still going to be R2, and you can make your decision whether you want it to be 5A or 5B. That's another way to tackle this, but for our purposes, trying to keep it simple, we're just reading right to it. Now, before we jump to the next piece of this, though, I will mention that there's some footnotes with all these graphs and tables inside the code, which are incredibly important. You don't see them here. You can download them. We've got copies of the footnotes that are inside this course, so you can take a look at them, or obviously with your own code book. But the key piece of this that you should be aware of is the sprinkler option. It is possible to extend the stories or increase the square footage using sprinklers. In our case, we didn't have to do that. We can just use the information right out of here. The sprinklers are just a nice extra, and we'll see why. Continue on. So with that knowledge, now we're actually getting to the real, something that's usable finally. So table 601 is where we take a look and we can find out exactly what's the rating we're going to need to have for the various assemblies. So it's very nicely organized here for type 5A. Rated straight down the row there. Everything pretty much has to be a 1-hour rated assembly for the structure, for the exterior walls, non-bearing walls, bearing walls, etc. So that all sounds very simple. What's missing here again, though, is the footnotes. And in the footnotes of this particular table, there's a piece that says, if you do have sprinklers, you can use that to, what's what I'm looking for? You can use it to override, I guess is the best word I can think of right now while I'm standing here. Override that 1 hour. So since we have sprinklers, we can in fact have a type 5A with all 0 hours in there with this structure. Now, there's another piece here which I'll mention again in passing, but this is why it's so critical to understand all the various footnotes and pieces, is that if we had used the sprinklers to increase the square footage, which were allowed on that prior chart, or if we used them to increase the number of stories, then we couldn't use them simultaneously to reduce these numbers here. So the code says you get one or the other. Either use it to increase your stories and your height, or you can use the sprinklers to decrease the rating of these various elements. One or the other. But right now we're setting it as 0 for all those elements. Continue on, please.